1. Shock hooked up the cameras caught it in an instant. The flash of a smile, the half-second pause before Pete Buttigieg leaned into the microphone. His voice carried that polished ease he had perfected over years on the political stage. And then, with the kind of smirk that seemed rehearsed, he dropped the line. A joke. A jab meant to land lightly, to seem clever, to win the crowd. For a fraction of a moment, there was laughter. Not the warm, genuine kind that swells from the gut, but the thin, nervous chuckle of people unsure whether to play along. The sound wavered, faltered, and died almost as quickly as it began. The room shifted. Some faces hardened. Others looked down, embarrassed. A few tried to stretch their smiles into something believable, but everyone felt it. The misfired he thought it was funny. Millions disagreed. And Jasmine Crockett? She was just getting started. The silence that followed was more powerful than any applause. It hung there, heavy, the kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it interrogates it. You could almost hear the heartbeat of a nation watching, waiting, sensing that something was about to erupt. Buttigieg adjusted his tie, a nervous flicker in his eyes betraying what his polished exterior fought to conceal. He wanted to reset, to recover, to move past it quickly. Yet the cameras were locked in. Millions of screens captured every twitch, every blink, every unspoken ounce of discomfort. Jasmine Crockett sat still, her gaze unwavering, her posture unshaken. She didn't rush to speak. She didn't need to. The longer she held her silence, the louder her presence became. It was the quiet before the storm, the kind of poise that turns an ordinary moment into a turning point. Viewers at home leaned closer. Clips of the awkward exchange were already racing across timelines, hashtags igniting like sparks in dry grass. The question wasn't whether the joke had failed, it was what would follow, because in politics, words are weapons. And when one misfires, the ricochet can be devastating. Pete Buttigieg had pulled the trigger on a line he thought was harmless. But the real story wasn't his stumble. The real story was what Jasmine Crockett was about to do with it. 2. Raise the stakes that the joke might have sounded small, even forgettable, to those who wanted to excuse it. A harmless quip, some would say. A slip of the tongue, others might insist. But for millions watching, the line struck with an edge sharper than Buttigieg could have imagined. It wasn't just about humor. It was about power. Who gets to laugh, and who is made the target of that laughter? Because when a man like Pete Buttigieg, polished by privilege and cushioned by political prestige, directs a joke at a woman like Jasmine Crockett, it carries weight. The kind of weight that generations have felt pressing down on them. The dismissive tone, the sly undercurrent of condescension. It was the echo of countless boardrooms, classrooms, and chambers where women of color have been treated as punchlines instead of equals. This wasn't just a joke. It was a reminder that the rules are different depending on who you are, how you look, and where you come from. For Jasmine Crockett, and for so many who saw themselves reflected in her, the laughter stung not because it was clever, but because it was cheap, and America was watching at a time when patience for cheapness had run thin. Voters were demanding something different. After years of empty slogans and polished sound bites, people craved authenticity, respect, dignity. They wanted leaders who understood that words matter, that jokes made at the expense of the marginalized don't dissolve into the air once they're spoken, but linger, bruise, and harden into memory. Humor can unite, but it can also divide. In the wrong moment, in the wrong tone, it unmasks the truth. And that was the mistake Buttigieg made. His carefully crafted image, sharp, witty, disciplined, was suddenly cracked. The mask slipped, and millions saw not just the joke, but the arrogance behind it. For many, it wasn't shocking that a politician misspoke. What made it matter was the target, Jasmine Crockett, a woman whose presence alone had already unsettled entrenched power. To diminish her with a laugh was to diminish what she represented: resilience, defiance, the very identity that millions carried with pride. The reaction was immediate, not just in the room, but across living rooms and phone screens nationwide. Viewers didn't just hear a joke, they heard a message. And the message was clear. Even now, even here, dignity could be treated as disposable. But Crockett knew better. She knew the eyes of the nation were on her, waiting, watching. And while Buttigieg thought the story might end with an awkward pause and a quick subject change, the real story was just beginning. Because what happened in that room wasn't about one failed attempt at humor. It was about whether arrogance would once again drown out dignity, or whether dignity, this time, would rise and reclaim the moment. And when the cameras kept rolling, that's when the real story began. 3. Antagonist backstory. To understand why the joke cut so sharply, you have to understand the man who delivered it. Pete Buttigieg has long been admired in certain circles as the picture of poise. Rhodes Scholar, Harvard graduate, former mayor, polished cabinet secretary. He is the kind of figure Washington loves to showcase. A man of resumes and accolades, a technocrat who speaks in calm, measured tones and delivers answers that sound tidy enough to fit into a press release. From the start of his rise, Buttigieg built his reputation on cleverness. He knew how to turn a phrase, how to craft a one-liner that seemed to carry both wit and wisdom. On debate stages, those lines often won him applause. In interviews, they offered him the shine of intellectual sharpness. His brand was that of the boy wonder, the politician who could laugh off criticism with a smirk, who could wrap policy in wordplay, who seemed unflappable. But behind the polish, there were cracks. To critics, Buttigieg's charm was never more than a thin veneer. They saw a man who could memorize the language of empathy, but rarely seemed to feel its pulse. They noticed the distance between his lived experience and those he claimed to speak for. His background, rooted in elite institutions, insulated him from the struggles faced by those on the margins. He could talk about inequality, but when pressed, his answers often sounded clinical, detached, as though poverty were a statistic to be managed rather than a wound to be healed. This wasn't lost on communities of color, many of whom had long memories of his tenure as mayor in South Bend. Decisions that alienated Black residents, strained relationships with community leaders, and a style of governance that felt more like management than leadership. All of it left scars that 1,000 clever quips couldn't erase. For many, Buttigieg represented a kind of arrogance that was harder to detect, but no less harmful. The arrogance of a man who believed intellect alone could substitute for connection. And so, when he stood in that room, when he leaned into the microphone with that familiar half-smile, his joke carried more than humor. It carried history. It carried the weight of years in which his polished exterior masked the reality of his blind spots. He was, after all, the man who preached empathy but stumbled when it mattered most. The man who could speak about unity in one breath and dismiss someone's lived reality in the next. That's why this moment mattered. Because it wasn't just a slip. It was a revelation. For all his accolades, for all his elite polish, Pete Buttigieg had shown again what many already suspected, that he was quick with words but slow with understanding. That he could deliver a clever line but miss the human cost. That he could smile as though nothing were wrong while the people in the room shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. He believed the joke would dissolve in the air, one more throwaway moment in a career built on carefully managed optics. But this time, the cameras didn't blink. The audience didn't forget. Millions were ready to hold him to the very standard he had so often set for others. Because the truth about words is that they reveal more than intent. They reveal character. And when the words came from Buttigieg's mouth, they revealed the contradiction at the heart of his rise. A man elevated as a symbol of empathy, yet undermined by the blind arrogance that empathy requires you to abandon. This wasn't the first time he had stumbled. But this time, his words wouldn't just fade away. They would spark a storm. Point 4. Protagonist backstory. To grasp why the silence that followed Buttigieg's joke carried so much electricity, you need to know who sat across from him. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in that room by accident, nor by inheritance. Her path was cut from struggle, sharpened by sacrifice, and lit by a conviction that would never bend to arrogance. Born into a family that knew hardship far better than comfort, Crockett's childhood was filled with lessons that couldn't be taught in ivy-covered classrooms. Her parents carried the weight of work on their shoulders, the kind of labor that leaves hands rough and backs sore, but spirits resilient. From them, she learned that dignity is not given, it is fought for. Respect is not handed down, it is earned. She was the kind of child who noticed everything. The unfairness in her neighborhood schools, the way opportunities seemed to bypass certain families, the way voices like hers were too often spoken over. Where others might have grown quiet, she grew sharper. Where others bent to expectation, she carved her own. The fire in her youth wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was the seed of justice taking root. As she grew older, Crockett chose service over spectacle. While others polished resumes with elite internships and prestigious fellowships, she walked directly into the courts and communities where people were being silenced. As a public defender, she stood beside those who had no one else. She heard the stories of mothers fighting to keep their children safe, of fathers struggling against a system tilted against them, of young men written off before they ever had a chance. Those stories became part of her. They built her spine, her voice, her resolve. It was never about being polished. It was about being present. She didn't dress her words in the language of bureaucracy or cloak them in the safety of detached analysis. She spoke raw, unvarnished truth, even when it stung. Especially when it stung. That was her power. She said the things others were too cautious, too calculating, too careful to utter. And people listened, not because she had mastered the art of performance, but because she lived the reality behind her words. In Congress, this authenticity became her signature. Where other representatives softened edges to appease donors or party elites, Crockett leaned into her sharpness. She wasn't afraid of confrontation. She thrived in it. Each clash with entrenched power added to her reputation, not as a loud voice for its own sake, but as a fearless defender of those too often left voiceless. She carried the rhythm of resilience, the cadence of struggle, the truth of someone who never forgot where she came from. Critics called her brash. Supporters called her unapologetically authentic. But to the people who saw themselves reflected in her story, the immigrants, the working poor, the women of color who had been dismissed and demeaned all their lives, she was something even more. Proof that dignity could stand tall in the halls of power without bowing to it. This is why Buttigieg's joke mattered. Because it wasn't landing on a woman who would roll her eyes and let it pass. It was aimed at someone who had spent her entire life fighting off the weight of belittlement. It was aimed at someone who had turned mockery into momentum, dismissal into defiance. For every moment she had been underestimated, every time she had been told to wait her turn, every slight that was meant to shrink her, Crockett had only grown stronger, and that strength was visible in the way she sat there that day, unshaken by the awkward laughter, unmoved by the smirk across the table. The years of grit had prepared her for this exact moment. She wasn't just responding for herself. She was carrying the dignity of millions who knew exactly how it felt to be the target of someone else's careless joke. The cameras would soon reveal that this wasn't the story of a polished politician scoring points at another's expense. It was the story of what happens when arrogance collides with authenticity, when condescension meets the unbreakable will of a woman who refuses to be diminished. And as the silence thickened in that room, viewers everywhere leaned forward, sensing that the air was about to change. Because if Buttigieg thought his line would be forgotten, he had misjudged his opponent. Then, as he shifted in his seat and tried to force another smirk, the tension snapped into focus. What came next would turn discomfort into confrontation. 5. Debate escalation. Pete Buttigieg wasn't used to losing a room. For years, his weapon had been wit. A quick remark, a clever aside, the kind of polished quip that drew polite laughter and shifted attention back to his control. And so, after the first joke fell flat, he tried again. Another jab, light in tone but heavy with that unmistakable edge of superiority. He smirked as though to say, "Don't take it so seriously." A few half-hearted chuckles surfaced, but they quickly dissolved into the same uneasy quiet. The silence this time wasn't simply awkward. It was defiant. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She sat rooted, her expression composed, but her eyes locked, unyielding. Where Buttigieg's words reached for levity, hers reached for weight. She didn't need to interrupt him. She didn't need to trade jab for jab. Her power wasn't in volume. It was in presence. And everyone in the room could feel it. The gravitational pull of a woman who refused to be diminished. The tension began to spread, visible in the shifting body language around them. Journalists adjusted their pens, hands pausing above notepads as though they didn't want to miss a single beat. Staffers on both sides leaned forward, their faces betraying the question that hung heavy. Who would break the silence first? Even other politicians, normally masters of composure, tilted subtly in their seats, eyes flicking back and forth like spectators at a prize fight. Buttigieg pressed on, his tone polished but straining under the weight of a crowd that wasn't laughing. He spoke of civility, of decorum, of how politics should rise above personal sensitivities. The words were designed to sound reasonable, but they carried an undercurrent, a subtle attempt to paint Crockett as too thin-skinned, too reactive, too emotional. It was the oldest trick in the book: diminish a woman of color not by confronting her arguments, but by dismissing her right to feel the sting of disrespect. And that's where the air thickened. Because the room knew, the cameras knew, and the millions watching knew. This wasn't just about a joke anymore. This was about power, about who gets to laugh and who is expected to laugh along, about whose dignity is seen as negotiable and whose is protected. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice. Instead, she leaned slightly forward in her chair, her hands steady, her gaze locked. She was calm, but it was the kind of calm that carries weight, the calm before thunder. She let Buttigieg's words hang in the air, refusing to fill the silence with anything but her presence. The journalists began scribbling faster. The audience, some leaning on elbows, some sitting ramrod straight, could feel the shift happening in real time. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was a reckoning. The energy in the room belonged not to the man still talking, but to the woman who hadn't yet spoken. And when Buttigieg, trying to reclaim control, forced another smirk, it only exposed the fragility beneath his performance. Because the more he smiled, the more it looked like desperation. The more he joked, the less anyone believed him. That's when it happened. Crockett, steady as stone, moved forward ever so slightly. Just enough to bridge the space. Just enough to signal that the silence was over. Then, Crockett leaned forward, and the air shifted. Point 6. The mic drop counterattacked that the silence before Jasmine Crockett spoke was thick, electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. Buttigieg still wore his practiced smile, but the edges had started to crack. He thought the pause might save him, thought the moment would dissolve. Instead, it deepened, every second stretching like an eternity, until the silence belonged to her and not to him. Then, with deliberate calm, Crockett began. "You know, Pete," she said softly, her voice carrying across the room without strain. "Jokes are supposed to reveal truth. And yours did." The audience stirred, a few murmurs slipping out. Buttigieg blinked, the smirk faltering ever so slightly. Crockett held his gaze, unblinking, every word measured like the slow, steady strike of a drum. "What you revealed," she continued, "isn't cleverness. It's contempt. It's the arrogance of a man who thinks dignity is something he can casually take from others because his title allows it." A low gasp rippled through the crowd. Pens scratched furiously against paper. Buttigieg shifted in his seat, but Crockett pressed on, each line sharper than the last. "You preach empathy. You brand yourself as the bridge builder, the thoughtful one, the voice of civility. And yet, when it mattered most, you chose mockery. When you had the chance to lift up, you punched down. When millions of people were watching to see if leadership could mean respect, you chose a laugh at someone else's expense." The room erupted in claps and murmurs, the kind of audience reaction that politicians dread, not polite applause, but the raw sound of people choosing a side. Buttigieg raised a hand slightly, as if to interrupt, but Crockett's eyes caught his and froze him in place. She leaned forward just a little more, her tone steady but gaining momentum. "You see, I've lived the reality you dismiss. I've walked into rooms where people like me are underestimated before we say a single word. I've heard the jokes, the ones dressed up as harmless, but dripping with the same condescension you thought would go unnoticed here tonight. And I know what those jokes are meant to do. They're meant to shrink us, to remind us of where you think we belong." A hush fell again. You could hear the faint shuffle of a camera repositioning. Buttigieg's smile had vanished now, replaced by the tight jaw of a man caught without his armor. "But here's what you forgot," Crockett said, her voice rising just enough to pierce the air. "We do not shrink. We rise. Every single time. You can laugh. You can sneer. But we are still here. Stronger. Louder. Unbreakable." Thunderous applause broke out, cutting across the tension like a wave. Some people stood, others slapped their desks in approval. The sound swallowed the room, and for the first time all night, Buttigieg had nothing to offer in return. Crockett let the applause crest, then lifted her hand slightly, an unspoken command for silence. It came almost instantly. The audience was with her now, hanging on every breath. "And let me be clear," she said, her tone slowing again, sharper, deadlier. I am not standing here tonight just for myself. I am standing for every woman who's ever been told she was too loud or too small. For every immigrant who's been laughed at for an accent. Every black and brown child who's been told to sit down and wait their turn. I am standing for dignity. And dignity is not up for debate. Another gasp, another eruption of applause. The camera lights glared brighter, feeding the moment into living rooms across the nation. Buttigieg's eyes darted to the floor, then to the crowd, then back to Crockett, but there was nowhere to look that could save him. Crockett's voice softened, but the softness was lethal. So laugh if you want, Pete. Hide behind clever words. But the truth is this. Your joke didn't make me small. It made you small. It showed the country the gap between the man you pretend to be and the man you revealed tonight. And once people see that gap, they don't unsee it. The room fell into stunned silence. Not a cough, not a shuffle, just the sound of Crockett's words echoing off the walls and lodging themselves into memory. Buttigieg tried to clear his throat, shifting as though he might respond, but it was too late. His carefully rehearsed posture had collapsed, his facade slipping visibly under the weight of her truth. The smirk that once seemed unshakable was gone, replaced by the look of a man suddenly aware that the ground beneath him was giving way. Crockett paused, letting the silence hang once more, letting everyone breathe in the enormity of what had just happened. She held her gaze steady on him, then swept it across the audience, locking eyes with strangers who suddenly felt seen, validated, represented, and then, with the precision of a blade, she delivered the final cut. History will not remember your joke, but it will remember what came after. The crowd erupted, cheers, applause, chants rising as though they were no longer in a debate hall, but at a rally. The cameras zoomed in on Crockett's calm face, her hands folded neatly in front of her, as if she hadn't just dismantled one of the most polished politicians in America. And as Buttigieg sat there, his composure shattered, it became clear. The joke that was meant to diminish had backfired so spectacularly that it elevated her instead. And when she finished, millions knew they had just witnessed history. 7. The aftermath shockwaves didn't take hours. It didn't even take minutes. Within seconds of Jasmine Crockett's words landing, the internet was already alive, screens lighting up across the country, hashtags forming before the debate had even closed. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag dignity not mockery. Hashtag joke that backfired. Each one racing across timelines, multiplying like wildfire, dragging Buttigieg's smirk into the spotlight where it could no longer hide. The first clips came from people in the room, shaky phone videos posted raw, unfiltered. The crowd could be heard gasping, cheering, chanting in the background. Millions shared those shaky clips before the networks even caught up. By the time the official debate footage aired, Crockett's counterattack had already been seen and replayed hundreds of thousands of times. Memes bloomed instantly. Buttigieg's frozen smile paired with captions like, "When the joke isn't funny anymore," or split screens showing him side by side with Crockett under the words, "Technocrat versus Truth." On Twitter, one user wrote, "I came for a debate. I stayed for history." Jasmine Crockett didn't just win tonight. She redefined the fight. Another, "Pete thought he was witty. Turns out, dignity claps back harder." Her mentions flooded, overflowing with messages from women, immigrants, and young activists calling her a symbol of strength, a defender of respect. And then came the commentators. Cable news anchors couldn't resist replaying the exchange on loop, the moment of silence before Crockett's counterattack now framed as the eye of the storm. CNN called it the debate's turning point. MSNBC went further. This wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a reckoning. Even some of Buttigieg's allies shifted uncomfortably on air, trying to defend him by suggesting the joke was lighthearted, but the defense fell flat. The images, the smirk, the silence, Crockett's steady eyes, told a story that words couldn't spin away. In op-eds, writers pointed to the symbolism. Here was a polished white male politician, once heralded as the next generation of Democratic leadership, being cut down not by scandal, not by policy, but by arrogance. And here was a black woman, underestimated and mocked in real time, turning that mockery into a stage for truth. The framing was irresistible. The joke that backfired became the headline splashed across newspapers and trending segments. But what turned it from a moment into a movement was the ripple effect. Churches, community groups, student organizations. Everywhere, people quoted Crockett's words, "Dignity is not up for debate." They printed it on signs, shared it as slogans, recited it in classrooms and boardrooms alike. What was meant as a joke had forced the nation into a conversation about who gets to laugh, about who gets to define the terms of respect, about whether cleverness matters more than character. And in that conversation, Crockett stood as the embodiment of the answer. Dignity over smugness, truth over performance, representation over arrogance. Buttigieg, meanwhile, found himself in unfamiliar territory. No longer the media darling, no longer the clever insider, but the man whose smile symbolized a brand of elitism progressives were growing impatient with. His allies scrambled, whispering to reporters that he had been misunderstood, that the backlash was out of proportion. But those explanations only fed the fire, sounding less like defense and more like excuses. The debate had ended, but the story was only beginning. And as Crockett's words echoed through newsrooms, timelines, and living rooms, one truth crystallized. History remembers moments, not punchlines. And this moment belonged to her. Cliffhanger. But the real test was still ahead. How would the political world reshape itself now that millions had seen what happens when dignity finally takes the mic? 8. The resolution to as the echoes of applause and the firestorm of online reactions settled, Jasmine Crockett's words began to take on a life of their own. This was no longer about a debate, no longer about a single joke or a single politician. It had become a mirror held up to the nation, reflecting a truth that had been too long ignored. Experience, resilience, and integrity outweigh polished lines, clever quips, and the illusion of authority. Crockett reframed the moment with clarity that cut through the noise. Experience isn't measured in polished jokes or clever lines, she said, her voice now replayed in thousands of clips, shared across timelines and living rooms. It's measured in resilience, in service, in truth. Those words were more than a retort, they were a manifesto. They were a statement about what leadership really looks like and what it demands from every one of us. For millions watching, it was validating. Immigrants, women of color, working families, anyone who had ever been underestimated or dismissed, they saw themselves in her. They saw their struggles, their sacrifices, and their dignity affirmed on a national stage. The applause wasn't just for Crockett. It was for every person who had been overlooked, every voice that had been silenced, every story that had been written off because it didn't fit the polished narrative of privilege. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Humility surpasses arrogance, and dignity outshines elitism. The contrast between her calm, grounded authority and Buttigieg's faltering charm crystallized for everyone watching the power of authenticity. It wasn't enough to speak well, one had to live truthfully. It wasn't enough to appear intelligent, one had to show empathy. And it wasn't enough to win applause in a room. One had to earn respect across generations. Crockett's counterattack became a blueprint for leadership built on principle rather than performance. She demonstrated that strength need not be loud, and courage need not be theatrical. In her measured words, in the way she held her gaze, she showed the nation that power without integrity is fragile, and that integrity, once asserted, has a momentum that cannot be ignored. This was not just a political moment. It was a cultural one. The conversation sparked by her presence and her words reached beyond party lines, beyond ballots and elections. It was about respect in every workplace, every classroom, every community. It was about the courage to stand firm when others try to diminish you. It was about the triumph of service over self-interest, of truth over spin, of the unyielding human spirit over calculated cleverness. And as the media, the public, and history absorbed what had happened, one thing became abundantly clear. The lesson of that day would endure. A single joke had attempted to undermine her, but it was her response, rooted in lived experience, guided by resilience, and articulated with unwavering truth, that would define the moment. The moral crescendo was undeniable. Dignity is not negotiable. Respect cannot be feigned. Truth cannot be silenced. And for everyone who had watched, felt, and shared in that triumph, the message was empowering. We all have the capacity to rise, to speak, to defend our worth, and to make history in the process. In the end, the nation saw what it looked like when authenticity meets courage. It was not a spectacle. It was a testament. And it reminded everyone that while jokes may fade, the power of truth endures. 9. Outro. Pete Buttigieg tried to make a joke, but Jasmine Crockett made history. That simple truth now echoes across screens, timelines, and conversations nationwide. What started as a casual attempt at humor turned into a defining moment, a testament to courage, authenticity, and the unshakable power of dignity. Millions witnessed a lesson far bigger than politics. They saw that experience cannot be measured by polished lines or clever quips, but by resilience, by service, by the courage to stand unyielding in the face of arrogance. They saw that when truth is spoken with clarity and conviction, it cannot be ignored or diminished. And they felt the ripple effect, the pride of identity, the power of representation, the affirmation that respect is not optional. It is essential if you believe truth still matters. If you believe dignity should always triumph over condescension, share this moment. Let others see what happens when someone refuses to be silenced, when someone chooses principle over performance, authenticity over pretense. This is more than a debate clip. This is a movement, a call to honor what is just, to elevate what is right, and to insist that arrogance never wins when courage speaks. Subscribe, join the conversation, amplify the message, and be part of a community that values truth over spin, service over self-interest, and dignity over elitism. Because history remembers those who stand firm. And thanks to Jasmine Crockett, we all know what it looks like to rise.